Hendrix. I only played you the last couple minutes of it, last minute of it there, whatever. August 1969, Woodstock, closing day of Woodstock. He was supposed to be scheduled late that night to end it, but it was so backed up because of the weather and whatever. He ended up playing, I don't know, 5, 6 o'clock in the morning to close out Woodstock, and the majority of people already went home, but he played a long set that's become iconic as far as Jimi Hendrix and Woodstock is concerned. Anyway, happy 4th of July. I know you're seeing this who knows when, and I know it's been a couple weeks again since I last recorded. I have a little red, white, and blue outfit on, today. And I hope you have a great today, whatever you have planned. But today we want to continue in our study here of Heroes and Heretics. This is part 29, and it is the second part of the 8th century. Last session we moved into the 8th century and spent our time looking at one major British missionary to the pagan-filled Western and Northern Europe, and one serious doctrinal issue that was dealt with during this time. The missionary was a fellow named Wilfrid, otherwise known as Boniface, who came from England. He's considered the missionary or the apostle to the Germans. Of course, Germany wasn't as such, as you're going to find out more today as we look at more about Europe, Western and Eastern, Europe, but he's considered the apostle of the Germans. And again, if you didn't get to watch that lesson, please go back and do so. He was a fascinating man of the Christian faith. And the doctrinal issue that we looked at was the topic of the seventh and the last great ecumenical council, which was known as the Second Council of Nicaea in 787 AD. And that main topic was the discussion about the iconoclast controversy. And if you don't know what that means, then again, I strongly urge you to watch the last video. But in a nutshell, the iconoclast controversy was over whether or not the church should encourage the use of icons, statues, pictures, images, of the saints, Jesus, angels, et al. In religious services. And the conclusion, which not everyone agreed with to this day, is that icons are acceptable as long as they are not being worshipped. Now, of course, I quoted John Calvin last session. He said the human heart is a perpetual idol factory. So no matter what, we're going to end up making idols of something, even if it's a statue of Mary, in your front yard, like a neighbor down the street. Wonderful folks. They're the first ones to put something up about Christ rose from the dead and Jesus, the meaning of the season, etc. at Christmas time and whatnot. And they have a statue of Mary, in their front yard. But anyway. So, although Christians of the Eastern Orthodox as well as Catholics would say we don't worship the icons or images, they just encourage our worship, but I have my doubts. The reformers of the 16th century and beyond are, in a sense, iconoclasts, destroyers of icons, although they're not bursting into Orthodox and Catholic churches, tearing them down. Anyway. Those were the two topics of our last session. In today's lesson, I want to look further into the 8th century and look at two very, very important figures of the last half of the 8th century, early 9th century, who both had a major impact on the spread of Christianity in Europe and beyond. And they were both very good friends with each other as well. Now, the first person we want to look at today is the King of the Franks, the man who became the emperor, the new emperor, in a sense, of the Holy Roman Empire 300 years after the last emperor of the decimated Roman Empire, and that being King Charles, or most famously known as Charlemagne, which is in Old French, it means Charles the Great. Now, to be honest, in all of my church history classes in seminary, I do not recall, let me see what time it is, by the way. I do not recall spending a lot of time talking about Charlemagne. Either I just don't remember it, or my church history professor, who was also the president of my seminary, Reformed Theological Seminary, who was one of the leading church historians alive, he still is, Frank A. James III, who just this past year retired as the president of a newer seminary, Missio Seminary in Philadelphia. He maybe didn't say much about Charlemagne. If he did, it's my mistake. But not to worry, I now know more about, more than you ever want to know, about this amazing and influential king and Christian. Now, as I mentioned in the last session, in the 8th century, the story of Christianity expanded from the British Isles to the primeval forests of northern Western Europe. The conversion of the pagan peoples in the European Dark Ages would be Christianity's major goal in a space of 100 years. And as we looked at in the previous few sessions, we saw the tremendous influx of eager and Christ-loving missionaries, not only who impacted Britain, but carried that evangelistic enthusiasm to the pagans throughout Europe. Throughout this 8th century, the continent would be united into one religious empire, creating a Europe we can recognize today, although the Christian faith isn't obviously as strong in Europe as it was, but you can still see its influence. Roman Christianity was thriving in Britain and Ireland, as we saw, but on the European continent, Germanic barbarian tribes had brought back paganism after the collapse of the Roman, Empire. The majority of the population of Western and Central Europe were now pagan again, or Christian to a fairly limited degree. And it's not easy to qualify, but across the Rhine, certainly the majority of the population would have been pagan or only recently subjected to Christian influence. Christian missionaries, again from England, Ireland, and the Frankish kingdoms, often were armed with a little more than a phrase book and the Word of God. And the early missionaries believed they needed nothing more than the gentle reasoning to persuade the pagans that God would give Christians a better life. And they did do an amazing job, but it didn't last. It wasn't carried on because of a lack of education and discipling. This area of Western Europe, France, Belgium, Netherlands, Luxembourg, Germany, over farther even to Poland, was filled, or should I say scattered, with brutish hordes of barbarians. After the Roman Empire fell in the 5th century, there was this great political void or vacuum in all of Western Europe and south down through Italy and to Rome. Now, these barbarians, who the Romans called the Franks, which means fierce, which they were, soon began to coalesce into a more organized race or tribe of people. And the first line of Frankish kings to rule were referred to as the Merovingian dynasty. Merovingian. And this is all in the notes. I gave you a lot of notes. The Merovingians were a family of Frankish kings who ruled during the 5th century AD, a key dynasty of rulers in the Dark Ages, continental Europe. And remember, as a sidebar, when we first talked about the Middle Ages and the early Dark Ages, one of the reasons it was called dark is because, and then we're talking the 5th, 6th centuries, because of lack of literature and writings, but that's controversial. That doesn't matter anyway. But they were often called, the Merovingians, long-haired kings, owing their tradition to keeping disheveled long hair. Now, after the Roman Empire collapsed, it was the Merovingians who stepped into the power vacuum, playing an important role in shaping the political map of Europe and providing basic stability in the region. They held control for over 250 years before being usurped and replaced by the Carolingian Carolingian dynasty, which I'll say more about in a minute. That's Carol, Carol, but it's Ling, Lingian. In the notes, I'll say more about them in a moment. Now, there is a curious association with this line of kings, the Merovingian kings. According to recent popular theories, as stated in the 1982 very fictional book, Holy Blood, Holy Grail, and the equally fictional and deeply heretical book and movies, The Da Vinci Code, the Merovingians, I'm not saying it just quite right, the Merovingians are identified as descendants of Jesus Christ, who apparently escaped crucifixion and fled to France with a pregnant Mary Magdalene settling there. That's their story. That's the story of the Da Vinci Code, whatever. And as another interesting note, and I have not been able to ascertain the connection, although once again I spent way too much time researching this silly topic, a major figure in the Matrix movies was known as the Merovingian. He was the polite Frenchman who was dressed real nice and eating fancy dinners, who met with Neo and whatever. But it's spelled the same way. And I don't know why. I tried to research it why. Doesn't matter. Anyway, the Merovingian dynasty got its name from Merowig, Merowig, or it's spelled Merovech, who is a Frankish leader from 447 AD to 457 AD. Now, there are some other weird, fishy, literally, stories about how they mythologically came about, but we don't need to go there. It's just weird stuff. Now, something interesting that happened in time during the Merovingian dynasty. As kings died, their young sons, children of the kings, were crowned kings. And individuals within this dynasty, not related to the family, but who held power over political areas that was given to them, they were referred to as majors of the palace, and that title morphed into mayors of the palace. And they began to have more and more power because the child kings and other adult kings were incapable of leading the people. So you had, when I say a palace, they were the mayor in charge of the palace, but that meant a large community there. So they were non-Merovingian family members who were noble people who were raised up in positions who were basically taking over because the kings weren't doing their job. So gradually, the Merovingian kings became figureheads. And these non-family mayors gradually began to take over. So this is where the next royal dynasty comes into the picture, the very important Carolingian dynasty. Wish I was saying it exactly right, but you look it up. They were a family of Frankish aristocrats, and the dynasty that they established was between 750 and 887 AD, so roughly 130 some years, to rule Western Europe. Now, the dynasty's name is from a large number of family members who bore the name Charles, most notably Charlemagne, who is one of the two main subjects in this lesson. We'll get to him in a second. Now again, the family came to power as hereditary mayors of the palace of the Frankish kingdoms of Austrasia, that's like Austria, Austrasia, that's the eastern part of Europe, and the other half was Neustra, Neustra. That's the western side. So the Frankish kingdoms were kind of divided into two sections, okay? Austrasia and Neustria. See the notes. Anyway, in 687, Pippin II, otherwise known as Pepin, Pippin II, or Pepin, Pepin, the first of the great Carolingian mayors of the palace, gained effective rule over the entire Frankish realm when he defeated his rival Evroin, Ebroin. At his death in 714, Pepin left a legitimate heir, a child of 6, and an illegitimate son, Charles Martel, who is the first Charles. Now, by 725, Charles Martel had established himself as ruler of the Franks. He reunited and established himself as ruler of the entire Frankish realm. In other words, those two they were combined in the one here. And he defeated a sizable Muslim raiding party at the famous Battle of Tours, also known as the Battle of Poitiers, Poiters. I'm sure the French have a better way of saying that. This happened in 732. So he became now the one king of this area, and really, in a sense, not the beginning of the Carolingian dynasty, because Pepin was, but he was the first one that kind of took charge. Now, when Charles Martel died in 741, and his sons Pepin the Short, I think he'd be Pepin II, but Pepin the Short, what a thing to say to, someone that you're, hey, we know you're the short guy, and his brother Carloman, Carloman, they divided the realm between themselves. Both Pepin and Carloman were Christians, and both continued the work of their father in supporting Saint Boniface in reforming the Frankish church and evangelizing the Saxons. You may remember that, from last time. That was one of the jobs that Boniface had, was to go back by the edict of the Pope to get the church back in, order there. And so Charles Martel was a professing Christian, and these guys were professing, Christians. So, but what happened was the Carloman, the son, who had part of the kingdom, he was a very serious religious person. So he decided to step down from his throne and enter the more serious religious life in 747. So Pepin the Short became the sole ruler. Now, his position was so secure that in 750 he deposed the last of the Merovingian kings, Childeric, Childeric III, who was really just a figurehead. And with the support of Pope Zacharias, had himself elected king by an assembly of Frankish nobles and consecrated by the bishop of the Roman Church. The realm was again divided on Pippin III's death in 768. But the death 3 years later of his younger son, Carloman, another Carloman, reunited all the territories in the hand of Pepin's elder son, Charles, who again became known as Charlemagne, Charles the Great. Charlemagne extended Frankish power by conquest. He was a warrior over virtually all of Gaul, Gaul, which is modern-day France and Belgium, and into Germany and down in Italy. He formed an alliance with the papacy, and in 774 created a papal state in central Italy. But let's back up. Charles, born in 748 AD, received his education from his mother and the monks at St. Denis. He could speak and read Latin and his native Germanic tongue, but he never learned to write, though he tried to his entire life. Interesting. He mastered the military and political arts close to his father's throne. Now, when Pepin died in 768, Charles was in his mid-20s, and he was vital, energetic, and at 6 feet 3.5 inches tall, he towered over his subjects. Sounds like King Saul with the Israelites. Again, when his brother Charlemagne died in 771, Charles was left the sole ruler of the Franks. Now, Charles, let's call him Charlemagne, early reign was marked by incessant warfare, which expanded his control in all directions. His longest wars, 772 to 785, were in the area just below modern Denmark against the Saxons. And as he conquered, he converted them to Christianity at the point of the sword. Now, this is the thing you got to understand about this time. This is not encouraged, and you're going to find out when we talk about our next character here how that all changed. But Charlemagne's purpose was to, believe it or not, to expand the kingdom of God, to expand Christianity. And he thought the best way to do it was by the sword, which is not good. Of course, the Muslims ended up doing this at this time and later as well. So as he conquered, he converted them to Christianity at the point of the sword. And if they did not receive Christian baptism, they were put to death. Not the best evangelistic and salvation theology. Pope Adrian or Hadrian, however you want to pronounce it, Hadrian. I'm not sure if I put his name in the notes. It's all right. He then asked for help down in the south, in Italy, calling on Charles to deliver them from the Lombards. This is northern and central Italy. Charles agreed and quickly compelled the Lombard king to retire to a monastery. That just cracks me up when I read that. Is that he's basically probably has the sword pointed at him and says, you got two options. You die right now and I take over, or I'll let you live and you join the monastery. He joined the monastery. So Charlemagne took the crown for himself in 774 and now ruled over much of what is modern northern Italy. During an Easter visit to Rome that year, he was greeted by the Pope with the words, "Behold, another Constantine who has risen in our times." I'm sure Charlemagne loved to hear that. Now, Charlemagne, his 778 campaign against the Spanish Moors, and if you're a Seinfeld fan, you remember the famous Bubble Boy episode where George is playing Trivial Pursuit with the Bubble Boy, and they're down to the last question, and it had to do about conquering what army was conquered, and blah, 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 blah. And he says, the Bubble Boy says, it's easy, it's the Moors. And George says, no, I'm sorry, it's the Moops. M-O-P-E-S. There's obviously a misspelling, or M-O-O-P-S. There was a misspelling on the card, and the Bubble Boy is arguing, going, no, it's the Moors. He says, I'm sorry, it says the Moops. And they start fighting, and the bubble breaks, and it's a great story. Anyway, I'm sorry I threw that in there for free. So, he attacks the Moors in northern Spain. It doesn't go very well. He was determined to secure the border south of the Pyrenees, which is the mountain range that separates France and Spain. And he finally did so in 801 when he captured Barcelona. So you see his kingdom is expanding and the gospel is expanding. Now in the meantime, because not only would people come into faith by the sword, which is not the best way, but he was bringing in, missionaries and monks and building monasteries, so education was improving, and we'll see more about that. So then there were more sincere conversions. Now, in the meantime, he had turned his attention to the southeast border of his lands and conquered and absorbed Bavaria. Looking southeast, he pushed further along the Danube River into the territory of the Avars, A-V-A-R-S. His defeat of these fierce warriors not only netted him 15 large wagons of gold and silver, but highlighted his political and military superiority to the Byzantine Empire to the east. I'll say more about them in a little bit. Now, his triumph culminated on Christmas 800, which would be the last year of the 8th century. Because remember, the century begins at 801. And this is one of the best known scenes of the Middle Ages. Pope Leo III crowned Charlemagne Emperor of the Romans. Big, big deal. Charles told his biographer that he attended the service unaware that the Pope was going to do this, but modern historians discount this as him being overly modest. In addition to complex political reasons for wanting the title, Charles had theological reasons. You see, Charles was also a great student of St. Augustine and much taken with his idea of, remember his famous book, The City of God. So he believed the church and state should be allied as forces in the unification of society. So on Christmas Day, 800, in the presence of Pope Leo III, Charlemagne was crowned emperor of the restored Roman Empire. Now remember, the Roman Empire died 300 years earlier, 470 something. So there was no emperor, there was no Roman Empire, which again is not completely true, because I'll explain that in a second. So the unity that Charlemagne was able to impose on Western Europe, however, fell victim to the ancient Frankish custom. I'm jumping to the very end of the story, then going back, of the custom of dividing a realm among all the deceased king's sons. So after his death in 814, we're not done with Charlemagne, I'm just throwing this in. When he died in 814, the kingdom kind of fell apart because all of the disorganization and disunity between his many sons. Now, Charles delineated the roles of state and church in a letter to Pope Leo. Here's a quote. "Our task as secular ruler is externally, with God's help, to defend with our arms the holy church of Christ against attacks by the heathen from any side and against invasion by the infidels, Muslims, which is what they call us, and internally to strengthen the church by the recognition of the Catholic faith." Once again, the Catholic Church was called the Catholic Church, but it wasn't as we know of it today. It was slowly becoming more like that, but it was still gospel preaching. Let me go back. "Your share, most holy Father, is to support our army with hands upraised to God, as did Moses in ancient days, so that the name of our Lord Jesus Christ may be glorified through the world." See, that's pretty, I like that. Charles then believed the titles Emperor of the Romans made him the successor to the Roman emperors. Never mind the fact that the Byzantine emperors, the Eastern Roman Empire, had called themselves this for centuries. Even though the Western Roman Empire fell, the Eastern, with the Eastern Orthodox Church, which would develop and come to a big division in 1054, AD, they said, no, we're still, Irene's the empress, and we got everything under control over here. But Charlemagne still said, nah, we're the ones, Now, Charlemagne, we need to understand this. He was a devout and serious Christian, and not excusing this at all, but he truly was. Yet, he struggled in the flesh. He struggled in regards to the women in his life with sexual encounters and illegitimate children, and that's that. But anyway, he truly was devout, just did not have that's another story. Now, Charles took seriously his mission to internally strengthen the church. Indeed, within his kingdom, he was far more influential in church affairs than was the Pope. Charles appointed and disposed bishops, directed a revision of the texts of the Bibles, instituted changes to the liturgy, set rules for life in the monasteries, and sent investigators to dismiss priests with insufficient learning or lack of piety. He had his deacon, named Paul, publish a collection of homilies for use throughout the kingdom, instructing him to peruse the writings of the early fathers and, as in a flowery meadow, pick the choicest blooms and weave a single garland of all that he can that they can put to use. Pretty poetic there. Charles also took an active interest in two main religious controversies of his area. The first, we'll talk more about in a little bit, is adoptionism, which was an old heresy that crept up again, which held that Jesus was not God from God, but was adopted as God's son during his lifetime. And I'll say more a little bit. And as we spoke about last session, he was involved in the iconoclastic controversy, iconoclasm, which condemns icons as idolatry. In his reforms, Charles showed that, like Constantine, he believed he was the overlord of the church, not dictator. He was very sincere about how he's involved with the church, and really wanted the church to prosper and people to grow, as you're going to find out in a little bit. Right now, education was also carefully tended. The partially illiterate Charles believed that success in his political and religious reforms depended on learning. Is a quote from him, although doing is right better than knowledge, knowledge comes before doing. Although doing right, I'll say that again. Although doing right is better than knowledge, knowledge comes before doing. So Charles was a patron of scholars, creating a school for as many children in the palace and accumulating an impressive library, which we'll talk more about in a second. The only copy of many classical texts we have today come from the pens of the monks he set to work. He felt it was so important. He required each cathedral and monastery to set up a school and compel the children of nobles to attend who might otherwise have considered this beneath them. Charles's government helped set the feudal system deeply in place. His armies were made of nobles, bound to him by oaths, and granted tracts of land to support themselves and their soldiers. He published his law in what's called capitularies, which simply means chapters. And I think this note's down below too. And he sent them through the realm by what's called in Latin missi dominici, M-I-S-S-I, D-O-M-I-N-I-C-I. These were pairs of inspectors, usually a bishop and a count, who made sure his orders that were written down in these capitularies, chapters, were taken to each section of the kingdom. Because remember, they didn't have internet. They had no way of easy access. So what he did is he had everything written down and sent to the people. So these pairs of inspectors could help the people, help bring order and justice. And he made sure his orders were obeyed in castles and in churches. And they traveled around the empire with these capitularies. And this was to help administer justice, fairness, and help districts which were, again, far from the king, to keep up with what was happening in the kingdom. Now, this energetic political, cultural, and religious reform is today known as the Carolingian Renaissance. This is before the big Renaissance. What's that called? The medieval Renaissance, the French Renaissance. I don't know. Can't remember what it's called right now. But this one might not be as well known, the Carolingian Renaissance, but it's very important, as you're going to see. And it's one reason Charles was given the name Great, in Latin, again, Charlemagne. Charlemagne, again, also known as Charles the Great, was one of the most, I'm going to review a little bit here, one of the most significant rulers in European history. He was the first unifier of Western and Central Europe after the fall of Western Roman Empire almost 300 years earlier. After the Western Roman Empire collapsed, and in the region of Gaul, France especially, Western Europe had been split into much smaller factions, and there was no one to pick up the pieces until Charlemagne. A common misconception about Charlemagne is that he was the great king of France. And that's an extreme understatement because Charlemagne ruled much, much more than France. In fact, he preceded the country itself. Remember, I mentioned that the name Franks means ferocious, and ferocious they indeed were. Again, for Charlemagne to have conquered and flourished the way he did, he would have needed to embody that tradition of being fierce in battle. His own grandfather, Charles Martel, was a very notable military genius, and as I mentioned earlier, is best known for his victory against the Muslims in the Battle of Tours. Now, Charlemagne united Western Europe, and his rule extended over to what is now France, northern Italy, Germany, Austria, Spain, the Netherlands, Denmark, and Poland, and many others. This level of unification hadn't been seen for centuries, and is why some consider him to be the father of Europe, or Pater Europea. That's P-A-T-E-R, I think this might be French, P-A-T-E-R, maybe Latin, E-U-R-O-P-A-E, the father of Europe. To unify Western and Central Europe wasn't an easy job. Charlemagne needed victory after victory. His battles with, you don't need to know these names, Saxons, Lombards, Saracens, Aquitanes, Moors, Bavarians, and the Slavs were all carefully planned, and his battles mostly won. He continued into Hispaniola, which is Spain, and battled the Moors, as I mentioned, and eventually won, successfully adding what is now Spain in his kingdom. Chased most of the Muslims out. It just wasn't enough for him to rule such a kingdom, despite his ever-growing territories and despite it being one of the largest kingdoms in centuries. Charlemagne wanted an empire. Now remember what I said earlier about what happened on Christmas Day, 800 AD, again the last year of the 8th century. Pope Leo consecrated Charlemagne as the Emperor of Rome, that is the entire Roman Empire. And remember also that the early Roman Empire fell in the middle of the 5th century, and the Eastern Roman Empire, otherwise known as the Byzantine Empire, I know I've said this already, but I still want you to get it, still existed, and at this time was ruled by Empress Irene of Athens. And relations were tense between the two rulers as their borders were very close, especially around, Venice. By this time, Charlemagne had designated many of his military tasks to his sons, and he turned his mind and attention towards less militant matters, embracing more the cultural, artistic, and spiritual inclinations. So far, I've shared what a great military and governing king or emperor Charlemagne has been, and he has been. But there's a much deeper and more significant aspect of Charlemagne's life that we cannot bypass. With Charlemagne focusing his attention of more cultural and spiritual issues, this would lead to one of the first great medieval renaissances during the Middle Ages. Along with founding the Carolingian Empire, Charlemagne also helped spur along one of the first of the great medieval renaissances in the church, known again as the Carolingian Renaissance, a vital contributor to the substantial increase in literature, writing, and other forms of art. He modeled his Renaissance against Rome's, the ancient classical Rome, not the deteriorating Western Rome of 300 years ago. And one of his first acts was to standardize the currency based on Roman currency. And this would become the precursor to the British pound, shillings, and pennies. But his focus would lie more in education and literature. That's why any good country, any smart country, any great democratic country is going to make sure they emphasize education, which, I'm sorry if any teachers are listening, but we're in trouble. God's on the throne now. Anyway, starting a great school for noble folk in Aachen, Aachen, which was the imperial city, I guess. He designated to his dear friend and influential scholar, Alcuin, the task of creating a standardized curriculum so that all of his subjects could learn to read. Alcuin, Alcuin, is the second fellow we want to talk about in this lesson. There is much proof and a good claim to Alcuin being the most influential Anglo-Saxon of them all, at least on an international level. We might not hear a lot about him, but we should, and I hope you folks will read more about him. Alcuin, one more time, Alcuin, down below, was born in Northumbria, which is mid-eastern England, and I do believe that's where Boniface came from, or some other great missionaries, came from. But he was born in the 730s. We don't know exactly when, and we know very little about his background, although it's speculated that he came from a family of some nobility. When he was a boy, Alcuin entered the school at York Minster, or York Church, during the episcopacy of, I don't know how to pronounce these names, Ecgbert, Ecgbrt. He was the bishop at that time, who was the brother of the king of Northumbria, which is King Eadberht. Very similar names. It was Ecgbert, the first guy, then in the process of establishing York as an archbishop, make that city and the cathedral there, a place for an archbishop, which was a big deal. And with it, undertaking a great reorganization and revitalization of the church's intellectual life. The school established there is specialized in providing a comprehensive education in the 7 classical liberal arts, which I'll mention to you in a second. I think this is fascinating. The school at York was to have a formative effect on Alcuin, and through him and the rest of Western Europe. Upon graduating in the 750s, Alcuin became the head of the York School, which, by the way, was founded in 627 by Paulinius, a Roman missionary sent to Britain in 604. That's right, because this is in York, who became the first bishop of York, which still exists today as St. Paul's School, making it the 3rd oldest school in the world. And I wanted to, but I resisted the temptation to find out where the 2 oldest schools were. I said, no, I can't do this. It's the 3rd oldest school. Now, Alcuin was also ordained a deacon, but there's no evidence to suggest that he ever became a priest, and not sure if he ever became a monk, although he certainly never married and lived an intense religious life. The net effect was for Alcuin to quickly attain a reputation for learning and piety, which made him a prime candidate to be sent to Rome in 781 to petition the Pope for official recognition of York's status as a diocese worthy of and to confirm the newly elected archbishop. Now, while staying in the Italian city, so he travels down to see the Pope. So while he's in the Italian city of Parma, which I'm guessing is where we get Parma cheese. Parmesan cheese. I've got blank on what I'm talking about. Anyway, Alcuin providentially met the Carolingian emperor Charlemagne, who was there, the most powerful man in Western Europe after the Pope, and possibly even more powerful than the Pope. Now, we don't know the exact details of the meeting, but Charlemagne and Alcuin clearly hit it off. The emperor was so impressed by the Englishman and his brilliance and his ideas about teaching that he invited Alcuin to return with him to the imperial city of Aachen, Aachen. You see, Charlemagne had a vision of turning his kingdom of the Franks, also known at the times as Francia, Francia, which became France. He wanted to turn that into a seat of learning and religion, Christianity. To that end, he gathered around him a circle of famous men from across Europe who would help educate both him and his people. So Alcuin seems to have been especially valuable since he was made head of the court school in Aachen, I'll call it that, making him personally responsible for the education of Charlemagne himself, his sons, and the sons of nobility. It was Alcuin who introduced Charlemagne to the liberal arts, and it was through his influence that they were structured into a two-part division. This is so cool. Two-part division of the introductory trivium, Trivium, 3, trivium, which was grammar, logic, and rhetoric, and the advanced quadrivium, arithmetic, it's 4, arithmetic, geometry, music, and astronomy, which define what we mean today by classical education. As a side note, classical education or classical school that we have in the area here still do this, and their emphasis isn't so much on what to learn, but how to learn. But there's an emphasis on those subjects, which I think is marvelous. Anyway, don't get me on education. Some evidence for how he taught in this setting is found in a book of recreational mathematical problems, which he probably wrote at some point between 791 and 799. The book called Problems to Sharpen the Young, and is filled with word puzzles meant to encourage mathematical and logical thinking. Several of the problems he created are still used in classrooms today in some form, such as, you may know this one, the wolf, the goat, and cabbage problem, which is more commonly found today as the fox, chicken, and grain problem. This is one where a farmer has to ferry all the objects, a fox, chicken, and grain, over the river in a tiny boat without any of the objects being eaten by any of the other objects. And do you know what the solution is? I'm sure you remember this. Well, very quickly, the farmer first takes the chicken over and leaves him there. Then he goes back to get the bag of grain. He takes the bag of grain over to the other side and drops it off, but to prevent the chicken from eating the grain, he takes the chicken back with him. When he gets to the original side, he drops the chicken back off and then takes the fox over and leaves him with the grain, the bag of grain, because the fox isn't going to eat the grain. Then he goes back to get the chicken. Now he goes back, now he has the chicken, fox, and grain, no problem. This was one of many Alcuin's thought puzzles. As well as the teacher, Alcuin also acted as advisor to Charlemagne, particularly on the issues of converting pagans. On this topic, as I mentioned near the beginning of this talk, the emperor had a bloodthirsty evangelistic zeal, which caused him to order the death penalty to any pagans who refused baptism as part of these decades-long Saxon wars to Christianize Saxony, which roughly corresponds to modern-day northwestern Germany. Charlemagne issued in 782 a capitulary, remember those rules, whatever, a royal ordinance which ordered that all Saxons who refused baptism were to be put to death. The Saxon wars were extremely bloody, and mass executions, sometimes on the scale of several thousand people in one day, are recorded. Alcuin was outraged by this and reprimanded the emperor, his friend, in a letter. He argued that false baptism is pointless since faith is an act of the will, and thus while you can force a person to be baptized, you cannot force them to believe, which is obviously essential to their salvation. This argument seems to have actually worked because Charlemagne did indeed make refusal to accept baptism a non-capital offense soon after. So that was great. He could influence the emperor theologically, biblically. Alcuin was next commissioned by the emperor to combat the adoptionist heresy, which I mentioned earlier, which appeared in Toledo. Not Toledo, Ohio. I don't know if this is where we get Holy Toledo from. Someone else researched that. If you remember from previous discussions on heresies, adoptionism was the view that God adopted Jesus as his son when he saw that the human Jesus led a sinless life, making him a deity. And this occurred after Jesus successfully withstood the temptations of the devil in the wilderness and culminated at his baptism. That's when he became divine. Alcuin successfully dealt with this heresy and was also involved in the iconoclastic controversy. Both he and Charlemagne did not agree with the Second Council of Nicaea's decision to make icons acceptable, and neither have Reformed folks and many others. The Roman Catholics and the Orthodox subscribe to this, and they wouldn't say they're worshiping them, but that's neither here nor there. It should be noted that Alcuin also established a library that showcased the value of books in a time before printing presses. Soon, with the advent of higher literacy, many scholars, the Charlemagne Renaissance, began clamoring for their own libraries, a goal that Charlemagne was more than happy to support. So we had monks writing like crazy, copying all of these books to distribute to other cities for other libraries, other countries. Alcuin also, this is cool stuff, he also standardized capital letters and certain forms of typography. I don't mean I'm talking about handwriting, writing and making letters standard and readable. Part of his reasoning for promoting literacy was bringing the Bible to more people. It was translated so that all of his linguistically diverse subjects could study and read it. The Carolingian Renaissance was also responsible, as I said earlier, for preserving many Latin texts. Before printing presses, monks had to laboriously hand copy every single letter, page, manuscript, and book for hundreds of these texts. It's safe to say, without this enormous task, the efforts of Latin scholars would have been long lost to history. Because of his efforts, we have Marcus Aurelius's Meditations, Virgil's Aeneid. Without Charlemagne's dedication, we'd also be deprived of the history of the Roman Empire by Tacitus, or Julius Caesar's personal account of his conquest of Gaul. We'd have no Cicero or Pliny's natural history. Ironically enough, Charlemagne never learned, as I said, how to write, though he could read. This may be why he prized the written words so much. He could appreciate the talents of others and wanted to share them with his entire empire. How are we going to learn the gospel unless it's preached, at least it's read and preached, etc.? At 71, I'm almost done here, Charlemagne developed pleurisy, contracted a fever, and died on January 21st, 1814. Some say having lost nearly all of his legitimate sons within the last few years may have played a part in his death, along with a tendency to push himself to the brink of everything he put his mind to. Living to 71 was a feat in itself for that period, given the average lifespan was much shorter. He had ruled Francia for nearly 50 years, creating an empire and starting a renaissance. Charlemagne's legacy can still be felt today. In fact, in a standard deck of playing cards, I meant to bring my cards in here with me. In a standard deck of playing cards, the King of Hearts is modeled after Charlemagne. How about that? Next time you're playing poker, point that out to someone. Just don't show them your heart until you reveal your cards. His military conquests are legendary. His unification came initially at a bloody price, but ultimately those became the first paving stones toward what is now modern Europe. Libraries, bibliophiles, and classical scholars have much to thank him and Alcuin for. He started as the king of the Franks, then the king of the Franks and the Lombards, Then many conquests later, he became the emperor of Rome and the emperor of the Carolingian Empire. It isn't easy to comprehend the magnitude of all that he's done or imagined our current world without his impact. And one thing is for sure, we won't forget his history or legacy, and his story lives on. And it's the same with Alcuin, not as famous as Charlemagne, but now you know the importance of this humble man of God who understood that learning, reading, and writing were essential to understanding and advancing the gospel. He died. When did he die? I thought I had that down there. I forget now where he died. He died sometime later. The last three things, a little bit of trivia for Alcuin. He was very influential in handwriting script. I'm talking about different fonts, the separation of words. They used to be squished together. And he invented the question mark. How do you like that? And I attach a 4-minute and 20 video to the notes that contains a letter by Alcuin to Charlemagne that concerns the correspondent about types of fonts. It's really amazing. It's a little 4-minute video. Some guy is reading the letter and they're showing you the what Alcuin had written and to show the king about different fonts. It's quite fascinating. Please click on it. It's only 4 minutes long. It will be at the bottom of the notes. I'll put it in the email too. Okay, so that's about it. I have no idea how long I went today, probably longer than I should have. But I got so into this. I learned so much about Charlemagne and Alcuin I just did not know. And next time we get together, we will be moving into the 9th century, the 800s. Some more fascinating things going on. Islam's moving on. We're getting closer to the Crusades, which I really want to clarify for you. So it's going to be good stuff. Okay? So, God bless America. Lord, help America. Lord, come quickly. In the meantime, Lord, please help our nation on this Independence Day. You know, the sad thing is, awful lot of young Americans today don't even know what freedom's all about. They don't appreciate it at all. Don't realize what we've come from. So pray they do. Okay? So anyway, love you all. Thank you for your patience and waiting for this and patience in watching all of this. I hope you have a great day, great week, and I'll try to get a lesson out here sooner than last time. Okay? God bless you all. Love you. Bye.